2 months after his death, the silence did not fade. It thickened, as if someone was pressing down on the surface, desperate to keep what lay beneath from rising. 2 months had passed since he fell from that building in Beijing. On paper it was simple. Alcohol. A late night. An accident. The official language was clean, efficient, and final. Yet outside the neat boundaries of press statements and brief reports, something far more unsettling began to take shape. The silence did not behave the way silence usually does. It did not calm. It did not settle. Instead, it grew heavier, almost physical, like damp air pressing against the chest. Information surfaced briefly, then vanished. Posts were deleted. Discussions closed without explanation. Keywords became invisible. It felt less like forgetting and more like erasure. For those who had followed his life, this absence spoke louder than any confirmation ever could. He had been known as a gentle presence, a familiar face shaped by historical dramas and soft-spoken interviews. Someone portrayed as modest, disciplined, and unusually detached from the excesses of fame. In recent years, images of him teaching in rural classrooms and working quietly with children had circulated widely. To the public, it suggested humility. A star stepping away from the spotlight to reconnect with something real. Then, without warning, that story ended. According to official statements, he had been drinking with friends. There were no signs of struggle. No evidence of criminal involvement. The conclusion arrived swiftly, wrapped in procedural certainty. Case closed. Tragedy accepted. Yet for many, the speed of that conclusion raised a question that refused to disappear. If the truth was so ordinary, why did everything surrounding it feel so tightly controlled? We are accustomed to public figures fading from relevance. Careers end. Scandals dissolve. Attention moves on. But this was different. The disappearance was not gradual. It was abrupt and deliberate, as if the space he once occupied was being carefully scrubbed clean. And then, an unexpected voice entered the conversation. Not from investigators, not from journalists, not from any institution bound to evidence or accountability. This perspective came from far outside the rational frame, from those who claimed to read not documents, but patterns. Not footage, but energy. They did not ask who pushed him or whether he slipped. They asked something far more disturbing. What if his life had never fully belonged to him? What if fame was not the reward, but the mechanism? From this viewpoint, admiration was not harmless. It was fuel. Attention, devotion, outrage, and grief all carried weight. The more intense the emotional investment, the stronger the system that fed on it. In this framework, celebrities were not merely entertainers. They were nodes, amplifiers, figures positioned carefully to channel collective feeling toward purposes never disclosed. Whether one believes such interpretations or dismisses them entirely, their emergence reveals something undeniable. When official narratives feel insufficient, people look elsewhere. And when answers are withheld, symbols begin to speak. If this truly was just an accident, time should have softened the edges. Instead, the question sharpened. The silence hardened. And the sense that something had been forced beneath the surface became impossible to ignore. And then an unexpected voice emerged. Not from the police, not from the media, but from a place where facts dissolve into symbols. Long before the night he fell, long before the official statements reduced his life to a few sterile sentences, there was a pattern forming around him. It was subtle, almost elegant. And, like most systems designed to endure, it hid behind admiration. From the outside, his rise appeared natural. He possessed the qualities audiences are trained to trust. A calm voice, a restrained demeanor, a face that carried both youth and melancholy. He did not dominate the screen. He softened it. In an industry addicted to excess, this restraint became his signature. But restraint can be mistaken for freedom. As his popularity expanded, so did the expectations placed upon him. Not simply to perform, but to embody. He was not only cast in roles. He was cast into a narrative, the humble star, the moral exception, the proof that fame could still be clean. Every interview reinforced it. Every curated image deepened it. And, with each repetition, the boundary between person and symbol grew thinner. In modern celebrity culture, attention is currency. But currency must circulate. It must be extracted, redirected, and converted. Admiration alone is not enough. It must evolve into emotional dependence, devotion, defense, conflict. The louder the debate surrounding a public figure, the more energy accumulates around them. From this perspective, controversy is not a flaw. It is a mechanism. Those who viewed him through this lens described a system that does not operate through overt violence or visible chains. It operates through permission, through contracts signed without ink, through expectations quietly accepted and never openly discussed. He was rewarded for compliance, not with freedom, but with visibility. And visibility, once granted, is rarely allowed to exist without conditions. As his image grew cleaner, his personal space narrowed. Schedules tightened. Appearances became symbolic rather than spontaneous. Even his charitable work, widely praised by the public, followed a precise rhythm. Rural schools, children, simplicity. To many it looked like escape. To others it resembled containment. A carefully managed environment where unpredictability could be minimized and narrative control maintained. We must be careful here. There is no document that proves intention. No recorded meeting where such decisions are laid bare. But patterns do not require confession. They require consistency. Those close to him described a gradual withdrawal. Not dramatic, not defiant, quiet. Meals skipped. Conversations shortened. A growing hesitation before accepting what was offered, whether food, schedules, or assurances. In isolation, these details mean little. Together, they form a portrait of someone becoming increasingly cautious within a world that demanded constant availability. In systems of power, usefulness determines worth. From an analytical standpoint, celebrities function as interfaces between institutions and the public. They humanize agendas. They soften narratives. They absorb emotional backlash that might otherwise target faceless structures. When a figure fulfills this role too well, they become indispensable. And when they begin to resist, they become inconvenient. What happens to those who are no longer useful, yet remain visible? Some observers believe this is where the metaphor of the chessboard becomes unavoidable. Not because it implies malice at every move, but because it acknowledges hierarchy. Pieces are advanced, protected, sacrificed, or removed based on position, not sentiment. No piece chooses the board. It is placed. Within this framework, his life no longer appears accidental. It appears directed. His ascent, his image, his constraints, all aligning toward a role he may never have fully understood until it was nearly complete. And yet, this interpretation does not require belief in conspiracies or unseen entities to feel unsettling. Even stripped of spiritual language, the conclusion remains uncomfortable. A human being reduced to function. Valued, not for who he was, but for what he represented. If his words are to be believed, the realization came too late. They treated me like an object. When they were done with me, they threw me away. Whether spoken, imagined, or projected, that sentence captures a truth many within systems of power quietly recognize. Agency erodes gradually. Dignity is negotiated. And departure, when it comes, is rarely on one's own terms. If he was never truly free while alive, then the implications of his death become far more complex than an accident report can contain. If he was not free in life, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. What kind of freedom awaited him in death? Every investigation, whether formal or imagined, eventually narrows toward a single moment. A compression point where timelines converge and ambiguity hardens into something irreversible. In this case, it was the night he fell. According to official accounts, the circumstances were unremarkable. A social gathering. Alcohol consumed. No evidence of confrontation. No forced entry. No struggle. The language was precise, clinical, and carefully limited. He fell from a building in Beijing. The conclusion followed immediately. An accident. Yet accidents by their nature leave disorder behind. Confusion. Loose ends. Competing accounts. This night produced none of that. It arrived prepackaged, already smoothed, already resolved. The emphasis was placed squarely on intoxication. Alcohol became the explanation and the containment strategy at once. It simplified motive. It dissolved responsibility. It reassured the public that nothing else needed to be examined. A fall under the influence requires no further inquiry. It closes itself, but timing matters. And context shapes meaning. In the hours leading up to his death, he was described as exhausted. Not merely tired, but depleted. His schedule had been relentless in the weeks prior. Public appearances followed by private obligations. Travel layered upon obligation. The kind of fatigue that does not disappear with rest, because it is not physical alone. Alcohol in this state becomes something more than a substance. It becomes a catalyst, a reliable method of weakening defenses, dulling judgment, and blurring consent. In many documented cases, power does not assert itself through force, but through timing. Waiting until resistance is no longer possible. We should pause here. There is no evidence that anyone pushed him. No verified indication of coercion. The facts do not support such a claim. But facts also do not forbid interpretation. From a symbolic perspective, the sequence is familiar. Isolation, exhaustion, intoxication. A controlled environment. Witnesses whose roles are undefined. This pattern appears repeatedly in historical accounts where outcomes were predetermined long before the final act. Whether one calls it manipulation, negligence, or coincidence depends largely on where one chooses to stop asking questions. The date itself has attracted particular attention. September 11th. A day that, in global memory, carries extraordinary symbolic weight. It marks collapse, shock, the sudden realization that structures once thought stable could fail without warning. To some, assigning meaning to dates is superstition. To others, it is a language power has always understood. Throughout history, those who seek to signal dominance or transformation have relied on symbols rather than declarations. Symbols bypass logic. They embed themselves in collective memory. They persist long after explanations fade. If the night was meant to be forgettable, the date ensured it would not be. In alternative interpretations, the gathering that evening was not social but procedural. Not a celebration but a threshold. A moment designed to extract something intangible. Compliance. Acceptance. A final surrender of agency. Within these frameworks, the fall is not the event itself, but the consequence of what preceded it. Again, this is not evidence. It is a lens. What remains indisputable is the aftermath. There was no prolonged investigation, no independent review, no release of comprehensive surveillance footage, no clarification sufficient to quiet public doubt. Instead, there was silence. And silence, when sustained deliberately, functions as a form of control. In systems where appearance must be maintained, unresolved questions are dangerous. They invite scrutiny. They disrupt narratives. The most efficient solution is not rebuttal, but removal. Erase the conversation and the problem dissolves. Yet it did not. Because, even without proof, the human mind resists closure when details feel incomplete. When a life ends abruptly and explanation arrives too quickly, suspicion becomes instinctive. It is not the presence of mystery that unsettles people. It is the insistence that there is none. Whether that night was the result of chance, pressure, or something more deliberate may never be established. But one conclusion remains unavoidable. From the moment he fell, the story ceased to belong to him. It was absorbed by a larger structure, managed, framed, sealed, and in that sealing, a boundary was crossed. The question is no longer what happened on that night. The question is why that night was treated as sufficient. Why the narrative was closed before it could be opened. Why uncertainty was met not with transparency, but with erasure. Whether ritual or coincidence, one thing remains undeniable. That night did not end a story. It sealed it. When human systems close their doors, attention often turns upward. Not because the sky holds answers, but because it offers distance. A way to speak about power, timing, and consequence without naming those who benefit from silence. In the weeks following his death, this shift became visible. The conversation moved away from witnesses and reports toward cycles and patterns. Not legal timelines, but cosmic ones. For some, this was escapism. For others, it was the only remaining language left untouched by censorship. Astrology, in this context, was not presented as prophecy. It functioned as metaphor. A framework that has survived for thousands of years precisely because it does not accuse. It observes. It describes movements rather than motives, climates rather than commands. The period that followed his death coincided with a dense convergence of symbols traditionally associated with concealment and revelation. Scorpio, long linked to secrecy, power, death, and rebirth, dominated the astrological landscape. Mercury, the planet associated with communication and information, entered retrograde within that same domain. In symbolic terms, speech was turning inward. Truths were being delayed, distorted, or buried. From an analytical perspective, such interpretations gain traction, not because they are provable, but because they resonate with lived experience. Information stalled. Explanations looped. Questions multiplied without resolution. The heavens appeared to mirror the ground. Observers pointed to late November as a threshold. A moment when multiple forces aligned, creating pressure beneath an otherwise calm surface. In astrological language, this does not suggest immediate upheaval. It suggests instability, hairline fractures. The kind that do not collapse structures overnight, but ensure they will never stand the same way again. Applied to the entertainment industry, the implications were unsettling. Power sustained by image cannot survive prolonged scrutiny. Systems built on silence depend on exhaustion. They wait for attention to drift, for outrage to cool, for memory to fade. But cycles do not erase. They return. Predictions surrounding the spring of 2026 were framed carefully. Not as a reckoning, but as a shift, a rebalancing. The possibility that documents long dismissed might be re-examined. That names once considered untouchable could be spoken aloud. That contracts assumed permanent might suddenly appear negotiable. In this interpretation, justice is not dramatic. It is incremental. It does not arrive with confessions or trials. It manifests as exposure, as the slow erosion of narratives that once felt immovable. Skeptics rightly point out that history is filled with predictions that lead nowhere. And yet, belief in cycles persists because it aligns with how societies actually change. Rarely through singular events, more often through accumulation. What makes this moment distinct is not the accuracy of any forecast, but the collective readiness to listen. When trust in official explanations erodes, people search for coherence elsewhere. Not because they reject reason, but because reason has been denied access. In this sense, astrology becomes less about the future and more about endurance. A reminder that systems built on suppression cannot maintain perfect control indefinitely. That silence requires constant effort. That forgetting must be enforced. And enforcement leaves traces. Returning to his case, the question of truth remains unresolved. There is no new evidence, no reopened investigation, no authoritative account capable of restoring confidence. What exists instead is movement beneath stillness, a sense that the story has not finished unfolding, even if it has been temporarily sealed. Perhaps the most restrained interpretation is also the most honest. That his death sits at the intersection of personal tragedy and structural opacity. That it reflects not a singular evil, but a landscape where transparency is conditional and accountability selective. Whether the future brings clarity or merely another layer of narrative remains to be seen. But history suggests this much. Stories suppressed too thoroughly have a tendency to resurface in altered form. They return not as accusations but as patterns that refuse to align with official memory. If justice arrives, it will likely do so quietly, through disclosures that seem unrelated at first, through shifts in power that only later reveal their origin, through time itself, which does not forget, even when instructed to do so. Justice, if it arrives, rarely announces itself. Sometimes it whispers. In the end, his story does not resolve itself into certainty. There is no final document released, no authoritative voice stepping forward to quiet every doubt. What remains is something far less satisfying, yet far more revealing. An absence shaped by intention. A silence that required effort to maintain. He was many things in life. A performer. A symbol. A projection of ideals carefully arranged for public consumption. But beneath every layer imposed upon him, there existed a simpler truth that should never be obscured. He was a human being, subject to exhaustion, to pressure, to systems that reward usefulness and punish deviation. When his life ended, the mechanisms surrounding him moved quickly. Narratives were sealed, conversations redirected. Memory itself became something to manage. This efficiency, more than any speculative theory, exposes the contours of power. Structures that operate without accountability depend not on force, but on compliance. And compliance is easiest to secure when questions are discouraged. We must be cautious not to turn his death into mythology, not to romanticize suffering or assign meaning where none can be proven. There is dignity in restraint. There is responsibility in refusing to exploit tragedy for certainty we do not possess. At the same time, there is danger in forgetting too easily. History does not advance solely through revolutions or revelations. It shifts through attention, through the collective decision to keep asking, even when answers are delayed. Silence relies on fatigue. It waits for grief to dull and curiosity to fade. It assumes that time will erase what control could not. But time does not erase. It archives. Whether future years bring clarification or merely new versions of the same story remains unknown. What is known is that systems built on concealment cannot endure perfect scrutiny forever. They fracture quietly, through inconsistencies, through moments when reality no longer aligns with the official record. Justice, when stripped of spectacle, is often disappointing. It arrives without ceremony, without apology. Sometimes it does not arrive at all, but its possibility depends on memory, on the refusal to accept erasure as closure. To remember him is not to assign blame without evidence. It is to acknowledge the cost of silence, to recognize that behind every controlled narrative lies a life once lived in full complexity. To speak his name without mockery, without consumption, without turning loss into entertainment. We may never know precisely what happened that night, but we can know this. The measure of a society is not how efficiently it closes its cases, but how honestly it confronts the discomfort left behind. Time does not forget. It only waits.